Today we are in the second week of our teaching series in the book of Daniel called Enduring Hope. Now, this is a kind of teaching series called a thematic series. That is, we're not going line by line through the book exegetically and pulling out all the meaning of every single word for as long as that takes, though that would be really fun for nerds like me. Instead, we're taking this book and we're asking a question of it. We're saying, where can we find hope in the book of Daniel? And this is really important because the book of Daniel is largely about how to find hope when you are exiled in a land and in a place or a situation that is not your own. That was the situation in which Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, found themselves when they were hauled off into captivity in Babylon. The book takes place around the time when Babylon was laying siege to Jerusalem, and Daniel and these three friends of his, who were all part of the royal family, were carried off and were enslaved, were moved out of their home as they watched it burn in the rearview mirror. And so we find here a gritty book, a real book, and yet a book that shows us where we can have hope, which is something that it seems like our world, and probably you, deeply need and don't have a lot of. So let's dive into the second chapter of the book of Daniel. It's a really long chapter, and so take a stretch, get a Gatorade, because it's a lot of text. But in this text today, we are going to see where hope can be found, and definitely where it can't. Let's dive in. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. And the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. But the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men in Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill him. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said to him, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, "I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation." The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered the king and said, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. You, O king, saw, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now, we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. This is the word of the Lord. Father, that is a lot. It's a strange story, especially to our ears. So help us understand it and show us, God, how this story should shape our hope. In Jesus' name, amen. I recently finished publishing a book that's out now. It's called Stop Taking Sides. And in the book, I'm taking from the Bible ideas that feel like they shouldn't fit together, and showing how if we hold these truths in tension, we develop virtue. And one of those two ideas that doesn't seem to go together well especially for Christians, is the idea of a future coming kingdom and a this worldly political reality. Kingdom and politics. And that's never more apparent than in an election year. Now, I'm getting older, and I can remember lots of election years. And they all feel roughly the same. They all feel like I'm being told that this is the most important election of my lifetime, and the choice is between heaven and hell, right and wrong, good and evil, the empire and the resistance, something like that. And that if I don't get out the vote, or if the vote doesn't go the right way, hell is mere votes away. And when that happens, as it's happening now, Christians who have been called to put their hope in God begin to relocate their hope in the world, in politics, in a this worldly reality. And then, when the election doesn't go the way we wanted, all of our hope is gone. You see, there's a lot we could talk about here in the book of Daniel. But I think that the book of Daniel here is revealing to us that hope in God and the future He's bringing changes your life. And your life reveals whether you hope in God at all. Now, I'm giving you the example, of course, of an election, but it doesn't have to be politics. It can be anything. Money or its absence can show you if you hope in God at all. The way you respond to your spouse can show you how you hope in God at all. The way you react when you're fired or you get a bad diagnosis, or if things are going really, really great and you forget all about them. Hope in God changes your whole life. And your whole life reveals whether you hope in God. And the cool thing about Daniel here is that his life very obviously reveals to us that the location of his hope wasn't in anything other than the God of his fathers, the God who is there. His life reveals that he actually hoped in God, and he has this expectation that God is going to move in power and do all kinds of things. See, Daniel hopes in God. Now, I want to just stop right there, because that seems to us maybe like common or easy, or like, no, duh, of course, Daniel's like a hero in the Bible. But Daniel's life was worse than yours. It was worse than yours. Daniel was part of the royal family of David, and Daniel got to watch with his own eyes his countrymen being killed, women and children being slaughtered, his own city being besieged, which, when you study ancient histories about the siege of a city, when an ancient army would come and surround a city, it would cut off the water, it would cut off the food, people would die in that city slowly. The things that Daniel saw were horrifyingly brutal, terrible, abusive, awful things. Daniel had a worse life than me, and he had it harder than you, I think. And he hoped in God. He was dragged as a slave out of his own country. He never saw his family again. He was parked in a refugee camp outside of the city of Babylon, and then he was about to get killed until he prayed and asked God for an extremely odd prayer request. Lord, show me my oppressive overlord's dreams, and then give me the spirit to interpret and encourage him. That's a weird situation, and yet, because Daniel hoped in God and the future that God promised to bring, he was utterly different in the way he lived his life, living a life that revealed that he hoped in God. Now, that's challenging to me. It's challenging in our current moment, because let's just think about what we've been walking through. We have the worst economy since the Great Depression. We've got the worst pandemic since 1914. We've got the worst race relations since the late 1960s, and we've got it all in an election year. Wow. Like, I don't know of a time in history, especially in modern history, when those things have all colluded together to reveal the gaps in our hope. Maybe today you're feeling hopeless. Friend, I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you're watching this, because hope in God and the future He brings will change your life. And I want to show you how that's possible here. It changed Daniel's life, because here he's facing a situation that was really, really, really hard, but because he knew the God of heaven, and because he knew what the future was going to be, that he brought, or that he was going to bring about, he had hope that wasn't built upon the situations of his life. Now, I'm trying to make the case to you that hoping in God and the future He brings changes the way that we act in the world. So how did it work for Daniel? We can see a couple of things. So first, we see that hoping in God and the future He brings is really important. In the dream, three things are revealed. In verse 37, we see that even Nebuchadnezzar, this terrible king, he was king because God let him be. And even in his terrible leadership, God was still king. So you and I need to know that even if we're being led by the greatest or the worst, if we're going through something wonderful or difficult, God is still king above, behind, and before that reality. And knowing that changes the way you live. The second thing that the dream reveals to us is the fact that even this worldly kingdom, it's going to disappear. Listen, I don't know if you have read your Bible, but the word America doesn't show up in it. Your job probably doesn't show up in it. Your name doesn't show up in it. There are things coming about that God promises to bring that aren't necessarily connected to the stuff and the places that we know and love in this world right now. That there's a kingdom coming that will never be destroyed. And that's the third thing that we see. There's going to be a rock that's hewn not by human hands that destroys all the other kingdoms and grows into its own kingdom that is never to be destroyed or demolished. That's the future that God is bringing. He's bringing the arrival of His kingdom and His good kingly leadership. So knowing that changed the way Daniel lived in the world. How did it change him? Well, the first thing that we see is that it made him prudent. Now, the virtue of prudence is just knowing how reality works and knowing how to respond to it. It is having a mind connected to reality. Now, over the last couple of decades, we've heard in a lot of pop culture things like my truth and my reality and my experience and how we feel and how we identify. And to greater and lesser degrees, some of those things are important. But if we don't know the truth, the reality, the King, and the way things are and should be, then we're not hoping in God, because we're hoping more in ourselves and our own experience of the world. If we hope in God and we trust in the future and the kingdom that He's bringing, it'll help us have prudence and see the world rightly. The second thing that it'll help us to do is to be engaged in the world, but not enmeshed in it. You see that Daniel was able to serve the king of Babylon without becoming captive to all the gifts and all the glitz and all the promotion and all the other stuff that he was given. Daniel was engaged, but not enmeshed. He was able to hold the tension of the coming kingdom and the political reality in which he found himself. And the third thing, and this is super powerful, if we hope in God and the future He brings, another change that we see that allows is for us to be able to worship in anything. I mean, Daniel was able to worship in the very empire, the head of the empire, that destroyed everything and everyone he loved, including the temple of the God that he loved and worshipped. That's quite something. Hope in God and the future He brings changes the way we live. But more often than not, how we live reveals that we don't hope in God. I would love to be the kind of person who could stand here and tell you that I look in the text of Scripture and I'm the kind of man who responds to the reality that I'm presented with much more like Daniel than Nebuchadnezzar. But the reality is, I, and probably you, are a bit more like Nebuchadnezzar than Daniel. See, Nebuchadnezzar's response to this moment reveals that he didn't hope in God. I mean, think about this. He was given a vision where he was told correct theology and about a kingdom that was coming one day that was going to destroy all the other kingdoms. And his response is to go, oh, so we're good? Like, there's no emergency right now? Cool. Promote that guy. And then he goes off. And he stays ignorant, proud, and unconnected to the God who's going to bring about that future kingdom. I would like to believe about myself that if I were Nebuchadnezzar, I'd have been like, whoa, there's this kingdom coming that's better than mine. How do I become a part of that? Daniel, teach me. But apart from grace, I wouldn't. And neither would you. But Daniel did. Daniel did, and he was able to hope in God even when he was getting blessed. You see, there's something amazing here. The beginning of this book, Daniel is like, he's a war refugee. He has no passport. He's got no country. He's got no people, and he's just seen and experienced some things that would send us all into the worst post-traumatic stress. And he worships as he's about to be killed. And then when everything gets reversed and he's given money and property and position and a government job with a great pension, his character is the same, and he still hopes in God. Hope in God and the future he brings will change the way you live, change your life, everything about it. But your life and everything about it reveals whether you and I hope in God at all. So, what do we do? Well, on some level, we want to be like Daniel, right? We want to be worshiping even when the world around us is falling apart, and we want to be properly engaged in the world, but not all enmeshed in it, and we want to hope in God and not in the kingdoms of this world. But if all I as a pastor do is tell you to be a little bit more like Daniel tomorrow than you were today, that might be inspiring, but it wouldn't be Christian. Because there's more going on here than just be better. Here, we actually get a vision of Jesus. This is one of the prophetic images that the Old Testament gives us for the rock who would not be crushed, the rock hewn from the mountain that would end up being the chief cornerstone of God's new temple people, us. Jesus is the rock taken from the mountain. Jesus is the one who comes after those 4 empires that were prophesied in that vision, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, and then the Roman. He comes and destroys them all, not with pure military might, but with who he is, and sets up a kingdom that outlasts and outshines any empire and can't be the political property of any party or group of people. He is not coming to be a better partisan. Jesus is the one coming to show that he's the king of all kingdoms and he's the ruler of all realities, and yet he is the one who was first crushed for us. You see, the Chaldeans in the story, they had it right. There is no one who can interpret the times and the seasons except a God, and a God doesn't live with flesh, but our God became flesh. He did live among us, and he became captive, as it were, to a particularly cruel political reality. And yet, as he said before his own crucifixion, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, I would tell my servants and they would fight, but my kingdom isn't like your kingdom. God's kingdom isn't like these kingdoms. It isn't like Babylon or Assyria or the Persian Empire or Rome or America. It isn't like this. And so before we act like Daniel, we've got to see Jesus Christ is the rock that knocks over all the kingdoms, yet the one whose kingdom is set up and invites all of the citizens of every other kingdom to come, not as exiles who have been conquered, but as exiles who are brought into his kingdom to be sent back out into the world. That's what you and I are, man. I opened this sermon by saying that this whole series is about finding hope in a land of exile, and you've got to see that this is not the kingdom yet. And if you're frustrated and you're like, yeah, but we need to make things better, that's true. Jesus Christ died to make things better and to bring about a kingdom reality in this world. But if you think your political action or your vote in November or your job or anything is going to be the thing that brings about the kingdom of God, you will never have hope. At least you won't ever have hope that isn't captive to some reality in this world. But hope in God and the kingdom he's bringing is exactly what allowed Christ to be who he was for us. And his life shows that he hoped in God. And now our new lives in him can also show that we hope in God. So if we trust Christ, what does it look like to have enduring hope in God in this strange and challenging moment in which we find ourselves. The first thing is that we're going to be engaged but not enmeshed. You see, Daniel got promoted, and he brought 3 other godly people with him. And he didn't use his power to influence the kingdom to try and set up a good Jewish political party and make Babylon into kind of a new Judah. He didn't do that. He just served the best he could where he was. And instead of figuring out how to make everything better up here, he focused on making one thing better right here. I know a lot of you have a lot of vision and you want to change the world, but are you willing to change your own habits, or change the way you interact with one person, or change your tone of voice, or change something in your life that's really hard and tangible? Because those are the kinds of little changes that, if we do them, have big kingdom impact. Daniel was engaged, but not enmeshed. What's that look like? Here I've got a chart I want to show you. If you're engaged, you're prudent and you're prayerful, but if you're enmeshed, you're either checked out or you're anxiously involved in everything. If you're engaged, you can be worshipful and not fearful, but if you're enmeshed, you're unable to worship until things are good. If you're engaged, you're humble yet bold, but if you're enmeshed, you're proud on the outside and overly timid and soft within. Now, this should provide for us an honest self-assessment, which is the second thing we should do. If we see that Christ and a vision of his kingdom can change the way we live in this world, then we should ask ourselves, how are we doing? How's your stress level this election season? How's your stress level in the weird moment in which we find ourselves, the challenges that are before us? How are you doing? Third, I would ask, where's your hope? Is your hope in God and the future he's bringing? Or is your hope in your this worldly reality? And finally, I would ask you to remember that you are an exile. This is not your home. That doesn't mean you don't care about it, nor that you care only about it, but that you care rightly about it, with hope in God, because hope in God changes your life. And your life will reveal whether you hope in God. Now, if you're hearing this and you're not yet a follower of Jesus, I want to invite you that today, right now, here in the chat, we would love to tell you about the one who is bringing about a kingdom that you can always hope in. And if you are a follower of Jesus, I want to encourage you to pray for and serve those around you who maybe don't yet know them. Invite them into this online experience. Invite them into one of our local congregations on Sunday, and invite them into your small group or into a class, and help them see that there's hope to be had in God and the future he's bringing that allows us to have changed lives. God bless you.